Little 30-second video goes quicker than you think. All right. Band, I appreciate you guys. I don't say it a lot because I'm usually walking off. Brother Bill says it sometimes, but I really do appreciate it. Y'all been doing really good. I feel like it's been good lately, and that's a lot because of them. So thank you guys, Greg, David, Todd, Lori, appreciate it. So we're going to be continuing on in our study in Matthew 5. Today we'll be looking at 33 through 37, but I just wanted to share a little story with you before we get started, that while we were all quarantined, Bill and Jeff were still coming up in here working because Jeff works about 50 yards from lives 50 yards from his workplace, and Brother Bill just felt like he could come, they could stay on opposite ends of the office and still socially distance, but the rest of us were staying home and working. So we were doing weekly staff meetings on Zoom call. So one particular week, we were doing that, and I had set up, I took my church computer home and set up this little nice office in our bedroom, set up like a card table, had a little computer back there, and that way I could isolate myself while the kids were finishing up their school and Cal was playing. Anyway, I could get a little bit of, alone place to work, So I had this little spot set up, and one particular week we had finished our staff meeting and we were almost done. We were done, actually. In fact, I think that some people had already logged off, but I do know for a fact that Tanya and Bill were still there. Jeff might have still been there as well. But right as we finished, Cal, who is 4 years old, came bursting through the door. Just being nosy, he would do that from time to time. And he comes bursting through the door, and when he comes in, Bill, Tanya, they're like, "Hey, Cal," just being nice to him. And so he hears them, and he leans to me and he says, "Can I talk with them?" And I thought for a second of all the things that he had been repeating lately, and if something, and so I tentatively said, "Okay." And he said this, and I'll do it in my best Cal voice. "If lightning ever struck our fig tree, Daddy would poop his panties." And so everybody burst into laughter, and so I had to they were like, "What did he say?" So all they heard was "poop his panties," and that made them, that brought the giggles. So I had to tell him, he said, if lightning ever struck our fig tree, Daddy would poop his panties. And I had to explain that a couple of nights before it had been raining and lightning, and we had been trying to teach the kids that when you see lightning, count, and you can count and try to figure out how far the lightning is away, mostly so that they wouldn't be afraid of thunder and they wouldn't be afraid of lightning, and that it's all okay and you don't need to be scared. And while we're talking about that, we're standing by our dinner table, and outside the dinner table about 10 yards away is a little fig tree, and one of the kids says, "So if lightning struck the fig tree, it wouldn't be scary?" And I said, "No, if lightning struck the fig tree, I'd poop my pants." To which a comment I still stand behind if that were to happen. Words. Words. Kids are always listening to your words. Today we're going to be looking at a passage that has to do with words. Surely you've heard the old proverb, "A man's word is his bond." I've heard that before. Words are powerful things. They've started wars, but they can also end conflicts. They can melt frozen hearts, and they can freeze hearts. But perhaps the most important thing about them is that they must be true. They're just empty. If they're not true, there's no reason for them. So that's what Jesus is going to be addressing in our passage, which again is Matthew 5:33 through 37. If you want to be turning there, turn with me to Matthew 5:33 through 37. And we'll begin reading together, verse 33. I'm going to read the whole passage, and then we'll come back and kind of break it down if we need to. Verse 33, "Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord.' But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. Let's pray together. Father, I pray that you would use this time as we study your word to open our hearts, to allow us to see something maybe deep in ourselves that we haven't noticed before, because the goal in all of this is to become more and more formed into the image of your Son. And so we're praying that that happens this morning with all of us. We pray that our hearts would be open and ready to be molded by you. All this we ask in Christ's name. Amen. So if you have your notes, if you have a bulletin and it's got notes on it, you notice I broke this down into 2 parts, because this is a sermon by Jesus, and that seems to me to be what he did, and I figure that you should probably follow Jesus' outline if you're going to preach his sermon. So looks like to me it's broken down by 2-part. And the first blank you have there is what does the law say? That's your first fill in the blank. What does the law say? We see that in verse 33. He says, "Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord." So when he says you've heard what the ancients were told, what he's talking about is what's been taught for a long time, and what we have written down, that's the Old Testament. They obviously wouldn't have called it the Old Testament. It just would have been, they called it the Testament. No, they didn't. That's not real. We've added that. It just was called the law, or the word of the Lord, or the scriptures. That's what they referred to it as, and that's all they had. So that's what he's referring to. So exactly what law then, it's a book of a lot of laws, it has story and narrative, but also a lot of laws, but exactly what law is he referring to? Well, there's several places in the Old Testament that we can look at. But before we even go there, we need to figure out exactly what Jesus is saying right here. Because our different English texts bring out different nuances of that word, make false vows. Okay? That's what I have in the New American Standard, the New King James Version, and that's what the NASB says, make false vows. The New King James Version and the ESV say swear falsely. The NIV, which I know some of you use, says, do not break your oath. And the KJV says, thou shalt not forswear thyself, which I don't have any idea what that means. I'm going to assume that it's something similar to what the New King James Version translates it as in modern English. So there seem to be 2 different nuances of this word that our English translations are trying to bring out in their translation. That's all you can do when you're trying to translate a language that's not your original into a new one, because those words don't always have a one-for-one. So here's the 2 possibilities. One is swearing something that is true when you know it to be false. Legally, we call that perjury. Swearing something is true, you stating that it is true when you know that it is not true. We call that perjury. That's used in a legal context, but it can also be used in others, and we'll talk about that later. It doesn't always have to be in a legal context. And then the second nuance to this word is to fail to do what one has promised under oath, or to break a promise. Right? So if you're in your notes, I'd write these 2 little things. It could mean perjury, saying something's true when you know it's not, or just breaking a promise. You see how those are different things. They have different nuances. They're very similar. In fact, you could, if you kind of keep thinking it through in your head, you could reason it out that they're really saying the same thing that's just working its way out in 2 different situations. But the nuance is a little bit different. So why the confusion amongst the different translations? Well, the problem is that the Greek word that they're trying to translate actually means both. And even there is a Greek lexicon or a Greek dictionary that every scholar uses that's kind of the authority on how the Bible translates into English, at least. And even that thing it says it could be either of these, which is really rare for that particular lexicon. It usually makes a choice, but here it says it could be one or it could be 2. It's hard because it makes sense in both. So then you're probably going to ask, well, okay, well then which is it? Which do you think it is, Adam, in all your great wisdom? That was sarcasm. Well, I think Jesus is actually, in his brilliance, choosing that word specifically because it can mean both. There are laws about not making false claims about others, and there are also laws about not breaking oaths. There are laws meaning both, and I think that's intentionally why he chooses that word, because it can mean both meanings. So what we're going to do next is look at the Old Testament passage laws that prohibit those two things, two sides of the same coin, you could say. And if you're note-taking type, like I said earlier, maybe put those two nuances to the word, and then what you would list under here is these passages. If I were you, I'd just write the passages I'm going to give you. Well, I'll read them, but you can just list those there. I happen to like it when I'm taking notes and somebody tells me exactly what to write in the notes. That makes me feel, y'all may not be that kind of note taker. You write whatever you want then. But if you're like me and you like to know, that's why I say it that way. So let's see. The first place that we're going to go look is the 10 Commandments, which are found in Exodus 20. All right? So let's flip in our Bibles to Exodus 20. Exodus 20, we're going to look at verse 7, which is actually the third commandment. Exodus 20, verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. So you may be thinking, what does taking the Lord's name in vain have to do with making false vows? Well, I hate to be the one to break the news to you, but the third commandment is not only about not using one particular curse word that has God's name in it. That's not what it means, okay? Using that word would be a way to break the commandment, but that's not what, so if you've been thinking, oh man, the third commandment, I don't have to worry about that, I never say those words. There's other ways you can, Jesus is bad about this, bringing up ways that you can break the commandments when you think you've got them licked. So here's what it means. In Hebrew, that word that we translate vain, take the Lord's name in vain, what does that mean? It actually is a word that, it's a really, really old Hebrew word that means anything that represents unreality. In fact, it's if you keep going way back in the Hebrew language, old documents, even older than the what Moses started writing down, it a lot of times it means, it's the word they translate for magic, right? And so you see how if you keep working that way out, it just represents anything that's not true, anything that's an illusion or just something that's not truthful. So the commandment is saying do not use the Lord's name in anything that doesn't represent what is real. One way that you could break this commandment is by using his name in an oath that you don't keep, right? You use his name, you are then now represent something that is not false, and that would be breaking this commandment. The oath doesn't come true, it's not real, it was false. That breaks the commandment. Another way you could break it is the way you and I probably taught as children, using that word, that curse word with God's name in it. In a sense, it still covers things like that because that diminishes God's glory, God being all glorious. So if you are using that word, you are diminishing his glory. You're representing something that is not true, and so that is also breaking this commandment. But you see how that commandment actually has a really broad meaning. Now let me step away from the passage for just a second and step onto a soapbox. I don't do soapboxes very often because usually when somebody tells me they're going to get on a soapbox, I turn it off. But this is one I thought I needed to say because I see it specifically in our church. Something I see with Pinecrest, people sitting in here that I think needs to be addressed. So we are marked by the name of God and Jesus, right? We call ourselves Christians. We're proud of that. I hope that none of us shy away from that moniker. And in the part of the world we live in, we're blessed that usually does not mean that you're going to be persecuted. So I hope you wear that proudly. The people you know that you follow Jesus, right? Or they should. Okay, so another thing we all believe, and it's actually one of the cores of our Christian beliefs, is that all human beings contain the image of God, the imago Dei in Latin, the image of God. We get that from Genesis 1:27, which says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So we're Christians, people know that. All human beings are made in God's image, and therefore we believe have a particular value that is higher of other things of the earth. So it's human beings are more important than animals or trees or plants, right? That's all something we agree upon. It's a fact. Those are facts, right? So when you diminish or insult or demean another human being, regardless of who they are and what they think, you are taking the Lord's name in vain. You are diminishing their image, which is imprinted with God's, and you were saying that person is less valuable than I am, or less valuable than other people. You say, well, I'm not saying that. That's what you're saying when you insult somebody, when you call them bad names, when you talk about them in negative light. You who are marked by the name of Christ are treating people in a way that is not consistent with his character. That's not how he treats those people. You're representing a falsehood. So don't do that. Both online, which is how I know that you're doing it because I see Facebook posts amongst us, and you can see those kind of things out there. And in person, I hear these kind of things. You know, you talk about somebody behind their back. Sometimes it's gossip. Sometimes it's just outright being mean about somebody. But that is breaking this commandment. Don't misrepresent God with your actions. Okay? All right, so off the soapbox and back to the text. So that's the third commandment, which has to do with false oaths. And the second commandment, not the second one in order, but the second one we're going to talk about, actually the ninth one, is found in verse 16. This also follows what Jesus is mentioning in Matthew chapter 5. Look at verse 16. This is probably the one you'd think we'd go to. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So we already mentioned perjury in a more legalistic sense, but it covers more than that. It covers more than just a legal sense. It covers other places. Obviously, don't lie under oath in the court of law. That's a sin. You shouldn't do that. But it's also much broader meaning. We can also bear false witness when we simply misrepresent someone's actions or what they said. I'm sure you may have had it happen to you at some point where someone misrepresents what you said or what you did, right? You did something, they see it a different way. My wife and I were talking about this the other day. I was asking her, do you have any stories like this? And she's like, oh, yeah, I have this story that happened at work. And then she went on a 30-minute story, which has way too many details for me to give y'all here, but I'll just summarize it here that basically she said at her business, she said something to somebody. She said the exact opposite, which, she had witnesses that wasn't the case, but they said, nope, they didn't believe it. And when you're a business owner, the customer is always right. And in the insurance company's minds, the customer is always right as well. And so that was a really hurtful, she was telling me like that whole week that stuff was going on, she was crying every day. And so don't feel sorry for her. I'm just saying you've probably have had something like that happen to you. And the problem is the other person is calling you a liar, and that hurts. But also it kind of attacks your character. Like you think, I've tried my whole, I don't try to live like that, and you're telling me I'm a liar. I'm not a liar. I know I'm not a liar. So that can be very hurtful. So don't do that to other people. Don't try to attribute to them something that they didn't say or misrepresent the way that they said something. So the thing is, when I think about myself, we tend to do that. It's tempting for us to do that when you find yourself like between a rock and a hard place. Particularly with me, I'm just going to be open about my sin. That if you catch me in some kind of falsehood, my first response, my initial gut reaction is to throw somebody else under the bus. Well, they said, no, I didn't say that. They said this, and in doing that, you're trying to save yourself by hurting somebody else's character and reputation, and that's not good. That breaks this commandment. So just don't misrepresent what other people said. Try to think the best of others until they prove to you that they really are trying to be malicious. All right, so let's move on to another verse. Another verse that's similar but slightly different is Leviticus 19:12. Leviticus 19:12. If you're looking for an exact verse that Jesus is quoting in Matthew 5, this is the one that comes the closest to it. Leviticus 19:12 says, "You shall not swear falsely by my name, so as to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." So this would be something like saying, I swear on the Lord that blank, blank, blank is true, when you know that it's not true. When you do that, you're trying to use God's name to add credibility to your lie. And again, kind of sort of getting back to the third commandment, it diminishes his holiness in your own heart, and he's too holy for us to involve him in our lies. So don't use his name in your lie. Don't lie in general, but certainly don't use his name in your lie. That's what they were trying to bring out in the Old Testament. Then lastly, Deuteronomy 23. Deuteronomy 23, 21 through 23. And this passage says, "When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it would be sin in you, and the Lord your God will surely require it of you. However, if you refrain from vowing, it would not be sin in you. You shall be careful to perform what goes out from your lips, just as you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised." All right, so this is more about the other aspect of swearing falsely, that you would make a vow to the Lord that you're unable to keep. That you say, you're making a vow this time to the Lord, not to others using his name. This is a direct vow to the Lord. This is one that we probably do more than we'd like to admit, because I don't know about you, but I'm constantly in this bartering acquisition, it seems like, with God, where, God, if you'll do this, I'll do that. If you do this, I'll do that, That's not good. The problem with this, and we'll see this in Jesus' response, is that ultimately we don't have much control over whether we're able to fulfill these vows or not. You're not in control of anything. Well, I'll do this. You may have the best intentions of doing it, and then you're not able to do it for some unforeseen circumstances. These making vows that you can't keep always reminds me of Cat Stevens. Y'all know Cat Stevens, folk singer of the 1970s? Anybody? Peace Train. I think that song is called Father and Son. Great songs. Anyway, Cat Stevens, British folk singer. There's this story happened to him. He was out swimming somewhere in the ocean, and I think he got caught in a rip current. And so he's being taken away from the shore, and he's fighting, and he can't make it back. And so he makes this vow to God. He says, God, if you'll save my life, I'll devote the rest of my life to you. All right? And so he was saved. The problem is, he thought that the way that he should fulfill that vow was by converting to Islam. That's what he did. So in his mind, he's carrying out his vow, but for those of us who know the truth, we realize he's actually serving a false god. So we shouldn't make these sort of vows because we ultimately can't control them. And Jesus is going to point that out in his response. So with that in mind, let's move on to Jesus' response here. Back to Matthew chapter 5. Back to Matthew chapter 5, reading it, starting in verse 34. But I say to you, okay, we're going to stop right here. Those words are kind of important. Several weeks ago when Brother Bill started the going through these little sections of this sermon that Jesus gave, he mentioned this, but I think it's worth bringing up again because it's important in understanding why Jesus is saying things the way he's saying them. The sermon I'm preaching this morning is really one little sub-point of a greater sermon that I would say begins in verse 17 and runs all the way through the end of chapter 5. You can kind of see it all follows Jesus' same line of thinking. And verse 17 says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." Okay, so that's his sermon statement, his topic statement, and then he goes on to explain that with all these other points. Then he begins a series of, "You have heard it said, ... but I say, ... These statements in which he's showing that he is not abolishing the law, but he's fulfilling it. So why does he have to do that? Why does he have to go and prove to them that he's fulfilling and not abolishing? Well, look down right here. You've been wondering what this whole stack of things was for. These are not hymnals. Several people thought they were hymnals. This is 12 books of volume 18 of the United States Federal Code. Okay, so the codes are our laws, right? This is 12 books, because I borrowed these from a friend of mine who's an attorney. There's 12 of them because that's all I could carry from the 4th floor down to my car. But this is volume 18. He had 12. We don't know how many more are in volume 18. There may be more. I doubt this is all. He rescued these from the dumpster because they looked good on his bookcase. You can pull all this up online now, but they used to have to buy these huge volumes. So here's the thing. This is 12 books of volume 18. There are 54 volumes, and each of those volumes has multiple books. So if you say that they average out to 10 books per volume, you're talking about 540 books that contain the U.S. Federal Code. That's just the Federal Code. That's not all the laws. Here's what happened. I called my friend and I said, hey, I need something that shows like the law code of Texas. And I sent him a message and he quickly called and he was like, that doesn't exist. You understand how, because this is just the federal code. This doesn't include our state laws. And then also you have county laws. You have municipality laws. You also have laws that are governed by different organizations like the environmental health thing. Those don't fall under this. Those fall under their laws, okay? So some estimates say that there are 17,000 pages of laws that we have to live by in America. 17,000 pages. That's a lot of laws. Now, why do I bring that up? I'm showing this to help you understand that the Old Testament law was never intended to be comprehensive. What God gave them in the Old Testament. If this is what it takes, this small little section, but you can imagine if that's what it takes for us to just write down our American laws, you see how ridiculous it would be for God to try to write down every law we would ever need. In fact, if he had to do that, he'd have to write down, and Moses, you don't know what a car is, but one day they'll come around and make sure that people are stopping at stop signs, and, that was never the intention of the Old. Now, you may read through the Old Testament law and be like, well, this sure seems like he's got some specific things, but I promise you, they're not meant to be incomplete. They're not supposed to be intensive. If I could give you, I found this illustration that helps me understand, maybe grasp what's going on in the Old Testament law. If you imagine the Old Testament as the floor, now I don't mean floor as in minimum, I mean floor as in foundation. Okay, so the Old Testament is the floor, the foundation on which God intended them to act out in their other interactions. And he has to give them a bunch. The 10 Commandments is enough if you really kind of narrow it all down. The 10 Commandments would make it where every law is obeyed if we follow them completely. But we don't, and so God had to even give more detail to certain things specifically for the Israelites, and then we have to kind of work those out, and Jesus gives us other ways. So the problem with that being the floor is that the leaders of Jesus' day, the Pharisees, Sadducees, the rabbis, scribes, they had started making it the whole thing, all right? Well, the problem with that is that when you do that, you start looking for little loopholes, right? Pharisees and Sadducees are lawyers, by trade, so that's what they're going to do. They start looking for little loopholes. How can we get around these things? What is a sin? What isn't a sin? You start trying to name it like that, and that's not what it was intended to do. So, for example, in this particular one that Jesus is going to bring up here, rabbis had started teaching these different levels or strata of oaths. So they taught that swearing by God's name was binding, but swearing by heaven and earth was not binding. You could swearing toward Jerusalem was binding, but swearing by Jerusalem was not. All right? And that was what the kind of things they were teaching. And so that's why Jesus says, but I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven or earth, for it is the throne of God, by earth, for it's the footstool of his feet, by Jerusalem. All right, he's naming all those details because that's what they were doing specifically, and he's telling them not to do that. So the Old Testament law was the floor, the foundation, and then throughout this chapter, and what Brother Bill's been teaching before and what he's going to continue to teach after this, is that Jesus is giving them the ceiling. All right, the Old Testament was the foundation, the floor, and Jesus is giving them the ceiling to shoot for. So, he's going to say, you've heard it said this, but I tell you this. You've heard it said, don't kill, but I tell you, if you hate, you've already killed. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I tell you, if you even lust, you've already committed adultery. And here he says, you've heard it say, don't make false vows, but I am going to tell you, just make all your speech truthful. You don't have to worry about this foundation. That's what he's talking about here. Don't swear by heaven or earth or try and give your vow more weight because you're appealing to some greater thing. In fact, if you keep going through verse 36, he even tells them not to make vows on themselves. Look at verse 36. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be yes, yes, no, no. Anything beyond this is of evil. So don't even make vows based on yourself. That's not calling on a higher authority. It's just calling on yourself. But don't even do that, because ultimately you're not in control of your life. Things can happen to you that are outside of your control. God's the only one in control. So then, this always gets brought up. Then is Jesus saying that we can't make vows or oaths, like in a legal sense? In fact, Quakers and some other denominations will try to say that that's what's going on here, that you can't, so they won't make a vow in court or whatever. No, that's not what he's saying, because there's actually there's a place in the end of Matthew chapter 26 where Jesus ends up swearing under oath. So if he wasn't, the chief priest is at his trial, and the chief priest is asking him all these questions, and he's staying silent. And then the chief priest says something like, I'm paraphrasing, swear by the God of heaven, are you the Christ? And he could have stayed silent because that's what he had been doing to the other questions, but he answers. And he says, that's what you've said, and so you're the one that said it. Like, so he answers under oath, so he obviously didn't think that was a sin, or he would be unperfect. Paul makes oaths in the New Testament. God himself in the Old Testament, you remember that weird scene where God makes a covenant with Abraham, and he has a dream, and there's a animal cut in half and a smoking fire pot. None of us know what a smoking fire pot is, but it goes between there. Okay, so what God is doing there is swearing an oath on himself, because nothing else can be sworn. And so he is saying, I will keep this covenant with you. So even God swears oaths. So that doesn't mean we can't swear them. If you get called into court, it's okay for you to raise your hand and make that promise. Please do tell the truth, or you will be sinning. But it's okay for us to swear an oath in court. The point is, you shouldn't need to take oaths, because your words should always be truthful. William Barclay, this famous pastor who wrote a lot of commentaries, said it this way, and I thought he said it better than I could. What Jesus is saying is this: the truly good man will never need to take an oath. The truth of his sayings and the reality of his promises need no such guarantee. But the fact that oaths are still sometimes necessary is the proof that men are not good men, and that this is not a good world. We have broken it, we've messed it up, and so that's why they're necessary. So Jesus' main point in this section is a simple one. Here's the takeaway. Just be truthful with your speech. It's as simple as that. No loopholes, no trying to justify yourself. Well, I said it because I was, just be truthful with your speech. No exceptions. Let your speech be always truthful, and you'll be closer. Because here's the thing, Jesus talks about that ceiling. The thing is, it can't be reached while we're in a human body, all right? But that's what we should be reaching for. Just let your speech be truthful, and you'll be getting closer to the ceiling of how God intended us to act in this world and be with one another. We're going to have a time of invitation where you can, if you have some decision to make, you can come forward. I'll be up here to hear anybody if you want to join the church, if you need to make a salvation, a profession of faith. If you've never understood who Jesus really was, that he paid the price for your sins, that is the only way to be right with God, today's the day you can do that. If you just want to from your seat, maybe God has pricked your heart in a particular aspect, if you just want to pray there and talk with God a little bit, that's perfectly fine. We'll sing a couple of verses of a song, and then we'll be dismissed. So let's all stand together. I'm going to pray, and then we'll sing together.